Imagine having a job where your boss literally cannot fire you for insulting them, where you can call the CEO an idiot to their face, and instead of getting escorted out by security, you get a raise, where you're the only person in the room allowed to tell the truth. Sounds like a fantasy, right? Well, for thousands of years, across almost every major civilization on Earth, this job actually existed. And weirdly enough, it might be making a comeback in Silicon Valley. Today, we're diving into the bizarre, brilliant world of court jesters, the original truth-tellers to power. And trust me, this story has way more to teach us about human psychology, economics, and power dynamics than you'd think. Here's something wild. Court jesters existed everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Ancient China had jesters for over 2,000 years. Medieval Europe, obviously, but also India, the Middle East, Japan, Africa, Polynesia, pre-Columbian Americas, even societies that had zero contact with each other, all independently invented the same job, professional fool. This is what anthropologists call convergent evolution, when completely different cultures solve the same problem in the same way. Which raises an interesting question. What problem were they solving? Think about it. You're a king, an emperor, a CEO, whatever. You're surrounded by yes men. Everyone wants something from you. Everyone's afraid of you. Everyone lies to you. How do you get accurate information? How do you know when you're about to make a catastrophic mistake? The answer, apparently, is to hire someone whose entire job is to make fun of you. The Chinese had a jester named Jester Meng, serving around 300 BC. In Europe, King Henry VIII had Will Sommers. The Mughal Emperor Akbar had Birbal. And here's the kicker. They all used the same techniques, the same jokes, the same psychological tricks. It's like humanity discovered a glitch in the power structure, and every civilization that reached a certain level of complexity independently found the same job. Let's talk behavioral economics for a second. There's this concept called information asymmetry, when one person knows something important that another person doesn't. In markets, this creates all kinds of problems. In courts, it's potentially lethal. Here's a real example from China around 200 BC. Emperor Qin Ershi, the second emperor of China, decides he wants to paint the Great Wall with lacquer. Make it nice and shiny. Nobody dares tell him this is completely insane, except his jester, a guy literally named Twistypole. Twistypole doesn't say, "That's stupid." Instead, he enthusiastically agrees. "Brilliant idea, Your Majesty. The lacquering will be easy. The only tricky part will be building the drying room." The emperor pauses. The drying room? "Oh yes, we'll need to build a structure large enough to cover the entire Great Wall while the lacquer dries. That might take a few years and maybe bankrupt the empire, but other than that, totally doable." The emperor laughed and dropped the plan. This is a technique called reductio ad absurdum, taking an idea to its logical conclusion to expose its flaws. But here's what makes it genius from a psychological standpoint. The jester lets the emperor discover his own mistake. No loss of face, no humiliation, just, "Oh, right, maybe that's not such a great idea." Compare this to modern corporate culture. How many companies have launched products that everyone knew would fail, but nobody felt safe saying it? How many bad decisions happen because of what psychologists call groupthink? The court jester was literally designed to solve this problem. So how did jesters get away with it? What was their secret sauce? Let me tell you about another Chinese jester called Newly Polished Mirror. One day, the emperor is out hunting and tramples the peasants' crops. The local magistrate politely asks him to stop. The emperor is furious and about to execute the guy. Then, Newly Polished Mirror jumps in. But he doesn't defend the magistrate. Instead, he turns to the magistrate and screams, "You idiot! Don't you know the emperor loves hunting? Instead of letting peasants waste this land growing food and paying taxes, why don't you make them starve so the whole area is empty for His Majesty to hunt in? You deserve to die for this." Then he turns to the emperor. "Please, Your Majesty, execute this fool." All the other jesters start applauding, agreeing the magistrate should die. The emperor burst out laughing. The magistrate was pardoned. This is psychological jujitsu. The jester doesn't oppose the emperor's anger, he redirects it. He agrees so enthusiastically, takes the logic so far that the absurdity becomes obvious. And because it's wrapped in humor, the emperor can change his mind without admitting he was wrong.
Jesters had a whole toolkit. Indirect criticism through stories. They'd tell a totally unrelated story that just happened to perfectly mirror the current situation. Riddles and wordplay. In China, there's this concept called fengyan, satirical remonstrance, using puns to make political points. Playing the fool, pretending to misunderstand something in a way that exposes the problem. Visual comedy. One jester appeared at a diplomatic negotiation dressed as a Taoist priest, mixing mud in a crucible, complaining there wasn't enough tu to mix properly. Tu means both soil and territory. He was saying the other side wasn't offering to return enough land. The genius here is plausible deniability. What? I was just making a joke. I'm just the fool. Now, you might be thinking, wait, could jesters really say anything? Not quite. Even jesters got fired, beaten, occasionally executed. The smart ones knew exactly where the line was, and they danced right up to it, but rarely crossed it. In medieval France, the king Louis XII had a jester named Triboulet. One day, Triboulet slapped the king on the behind in public. The king was not amused and sentenced him to death, but then he offered Triboulet one last mercy. He could choose how he would die. Triboulet's response, "I choose to die of old age." The king laughed and pardoned him. See what happened there? Even facing execution, the jester's wit saved him. But here's the thing, he was sentenced to death in the first place. The license wasn't unlimited, it was negotiated, constantly. This teaches us something important about power dynamics. The jester's freedom wasn't inherent, it was performative. As long as they were funny, clever, and useful, they survived. The moment they stopped being amusing or became genuinely threatening, the game was over. It's like a high wire act. The thrill comes from the danger. Here's something weird. Across many cultures, jesters were often people with physical disabilities. Dwarfs were particularly common. Hunchbacks, people with unusual appearances. Why? There are a few theories. One is purely practical. In societies where your job prospects were determined by your physical ability to farm or fight, having a sharp wit might be your only economic option. But there's something deeper going on. Anthropologically, the liminal figure, someone who exists outside normal social categories, often has special permissions. They're not quite part of the regular hierarchy, so the regular rules don't fully apply to them. There's also the sad clown effect. Someone with a physical difference making jokes about kings and nobles. There's less threat there. The emperor's not competing with them. He can laugh at their jokes without feeling challenged in his masculinity or power. This gets dark when you think about it. These were often people with limited options, using humor as a survival strategy. But it also shows how humans across cultures recognize that outsider perspectives have value. Even today, some of our best comedians and social critics are people who grew up feeling like outsiders. They learn to observe power from the margins. That's where the clearest view often is. Let's talk about the actual relationship between jesters and their bosses, because it's fascinatingly complex. In the best cases, it was like an intellectual partnership. The jester wasn't just entertainment, they were a trusted advisor, a confidant, sometimes the only person the ruler could be honest with. Emperor Wu of Han had a jester named Dongfang Shuo. One time the emperor gave out meat to his attendants, but the person in charge of distributing it didn't show up. Dongfang Shuo just took his sword, cut off a chunk for himself, and went home. The emperor was annoyed. You broke protocol, criticized yourself. So Dongfang Shuo launched into this etic self-criticism that was actually thinly veiled self-praise, ending with calling himself brilliant. The emperor laughed and pardoned him. But here's what's interesting. This works because there's genuine affection there. The emperor likes his jester. He enjoys the verbal sparring. It's intellectually stimulating in a way that formal court ceremony isn't. Psychologically, this makes sense. When you're at the top, genuine human connection is rare. Everyone wants something. Everyone's performing. The jester, paradoxically, might be the most authentic relationship the ruler has, even though the jester is literally performing all the time. There's a term in psychology, mortality salience. When powerful people are reminded of their human limitations, they often become better decision-makers. The jester was a constant reminder, you're human, you make mistakes, you're not actually a god. For a leader, that might be the most valuable service anyone can provide. Here's where it gets interesting for our understanding of performance in society. In China, jesters eventually merged with theater. The skills were similar: improvisation, physical comedy, social commentary. Eventually, professional actors took over many of the jester's functions, and the role of court jester declined.
In Europe, the relationship was reversed. Playwrights like Shakespeare created jester characters based on real court jesters. Think Touchstone in As You Like It, Fest in Twelfth Night, or the Fool in King Lear. These weren't just comic relief, they were the truth-tellers, the ones who could say what the noble characters couldn't. In King Lear, the fool is the only one who tells Lear he's being an idiot for dividing his kingdom. Everyone else either flatters him or stays silent. The fool? Thou shouldest not have been old till thou hadst been wise. That's a jester move right there. What's fascinating is how theater became a space for social criticism once court jesters declined. The function didn't disappear, it just migrated to a different platform, from the throne room to the stage to eventually newspapers, cartoons, and stand-up comedy. The medieval French had these performances called sotties, plays performed by actors dressed as fools who would mock current events and politics. They could say things in a play that you'd be arrested for saying on the street. Sounds familiar? That's basically modern satirical news shows. The format changed, the function remained. So here's where it gets weird. The court jester might actually be coming back. In the 1990s, British Airways hired a guy named Paul Birch as their official corporate jester. His job, wander around the company, ask awkward questions, challenge assumptions, be, in his words, a pain in the arse. For a while, it worked brilliantly. He'd sit in on executive meetings and point out when people were being stupid. He'd use Edward de Bono's provocative operations to challenge groupthink. The company got great publicity. Recruitment got applications from people who said, if you hire a jester, you must be a good place to work. Then there was a leadership change. The new strategy director told Birch, you've been taking the piss for the last year and it's got to stop. Birch pointed out that taking the piss was literally his job. He was fired. But here's what's interesting. Birch said the half-life of a corporate fool is about 6 to 9 months, which, when you think about it, tracks with historical jesters. The license they had was always conditional, always negotiated, always dependent on the tolerance of whoever's in charge. Since then, more companies have started recognizing the value of this role, even if they don't call it jester. Innovation consultants, devil's advocates, provocateurs. Prince Al-Walid bin Talal of Saudi Arabia, one of the world's richest people, actually keeps court jesters, traditional ones, in 2024. And his business empire is worth billions. Think about it. In an era of algorithmic echo chambers, corporate yes men, and confirmation bias on steroids, maybe we need jesters more than ever. Let's dig into the deeper psychology here, because jesters tap into something fundamental about how human cognition works. There's a concept in behavioral economics called costly signaling. When someone does something that's risky or expensive with no obvious benefit, it signals something important about their quality or intentions. Jesters engaged in costly signaling constantly. By risking execution to tell the truth, they signaled, I'm not trying to manipulate you for personal gain. I'm genuinely trying to help you. That's incredibly valuable information for a leader to have. There's also the concept of frame breaking. Our brains work by creating mental models, frames for how the world works. Sometimes those frames become rigid and prevent us from seeing reality. Humor is one of the only tools that can shatter a frame without triggering defensive resistance. When Jester Ming cried about the emperor's dead horse getting too small a funeral and suggested burying it like a king, he was frame-breaking. He took the emperor's emotional logic and pushed it to an absurd extreme, forcing a reframe. Oh, maybe I'm being ridiculous here. This is why jesters were so effective. They weren't attacking their rulers' egos directly. They were exploiting a cognitive backdoor through humor. Modern psychology recognizes this too. Therapists sometimes use humor to help clients see patterns they're stuck in. The best teachers use funny analogies to break down complex concepts. Late-night comedians use jokes to make political points that would be dismissed if stated seriously. The jester understood something deep about human psychology. Truth needs sugarcoating, not because people are weak, but because defensiveness is hardwired. Humor disarms defenses. Here's the big lesson. Power creates blindness. The higher you climb in any hierarchy, corporate, political, academic, whatever, the less accurate information you receive. People filter what they tell you. They hide problems. They exaggerate successes. They tell you what they think you want to hear. This isn't because people are evil. It's because the power dynamic creates incentive structures that reward deception and punish honesty. The court jester was a structural solution to a structural problem. Think of modern equivalents. Investigative journalists, they ask uncomfortable questions that powerful people don't want to answer. Whistleblowers, they expose inconvenient truths, often with great personal cost. Good friends, the ones who tell you when you're being an idiot, even when it's awkward. Anonymous feedback systems, companies that actually want honest employee feedback, create structures where truth-telling isn't punished. The common thread? Creating space where truth can be spoken without destroying the truth-teller. Medieval kings understood this instinctively, which is why they protected their jesters. A jester who could be fired for honesty was useless. The whole point was having someone who couldn't be silenced.
Of course, as we've seen, this was always imperfect. Even jesters got punished sometimes. But the ideal, the aspiration, was that they should be immune. That's what made them valuable. In modern democracies, we try to build this into institutions: freedom of the press, protection for whistleblowers, in theory, academic freedom. These are all attempts to create jester space in the power structure. But institutions are always imperfect, which is why individual jesters, people willing to risk their careers to point out that the emperor has no clothes, remain essential. So what can we actually learn from jesters? How can we apply this to our own lives? First, frame uncomfortable truths as questions, not accusations. Instead of, "Your strategy is terrible," try, "What happens if our assumptions about market growth are wrong?" The jester's trick was making the powerful person discover the problem themselves. That's way more effective than forcing a confrontation. Second, use humor to disarm defensiveness. This doesn't mean making everything a joke, but analogies, absurd examples, and self-deprecating humor can help people hear hard truths they'd otherwise resist. Remember Twisty Pole in The Great Wall? He didn't say, "That's stupid." He enthusiastically agreed, then pointed out one tiny practical problem, the drying room, that made the whole thing collapse. Third, know your license. Jesters who survived understood their boundaries. They pushed right up to the line, but rarely crossed it. In modern contexts, this means understanding your organization's culture, your boss's triggers, and how much capital you've built up through previous successes. Fourth, provide value beyond criticism. Jesters weren't just critics, they were entertainers, advisors, confidants. They made their bosses' lives better in multiple ways. That gave them permission to occasionally make their bosses uncomfortable. If you want license to challenge power, you need to provide enough value in other areas that people tolerate your provocations. Fifth, create jester space in your own organizations. If you're a leader, actively protect people who tell you uncomfortable truths. Reward it, celebrate it, create structures where honest feedback is safe. Because here's the thing, you need jesters. Everyone in power needs jesters, otherwise you're flying blind. Let me end with one of my favorite jester stories.
There was a Chinese jester named Dongfang Shuo who, according to legend, stole peaches of immortality from the gods. He got caught and beaten for it, tried again, got caught again. At the end of the play written about him, he recites a poem saying that physical immortality is nothing compared to his immortality of his 3-inch tongue, his wit. And you know what? He was right. Dongfang Shuo lived over 2,000 years ago. The emperors he served are footnotes in history books, but his jokes, still funny. His techniques, still relevant. His stories, still told. That's the paradox of the fool. They're the lowest person in the room by rank, but the highest by influence. They have no formal power, but they shape how power sees itself. They're supposed to be ridiculous, but they're often the only ones making sense. Across thousands of years and dozens of cultures, humanity kept independently inventing the same role because we need it. We need someone to tell us when we're being idiots. We need someone to laugh at our pretensions. We need someone to remind us we're human. In a world of algorithm-driven echo chambers, corporate yes cultures, and political tribalism, maybe that need has never been greater. So next time you're in a meeting and everyone's nodding along with a terrible idea, channel your inner jester. Ask the awkward question. Point out the obvious problem everyone's ignoring. Make the joke that needs to be made. Just maybe have a backup plan, because as Paul Birch learned, the half-life of a fool is only about 6 months. But hey, at least you'll go down swinging.
And let me know, what's the most jester-like thing you've ever done? Did you survive?
If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you next time!